It's an incredible Kiddush Hashem, incredible Kiddush Hashem, what the Olam is doing, learning the halachas of Shvius in America. This is even a bigger Kiddush. We know that the Rabbeinu Tam in Gittin has a Kiddush, an incredible Kiddush, that he holds that Eretz Yisrael extends all the way through Europe. And we've reached all the way now to America, Baruch Hashem. And the Olam is learning the halachas of Shvius, of Shmitta, showing that incredible tshuka and ahava for Eretz Yisrael and for the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael, and that incredible tshuka to come back to Eretz Yisrael. And that's a vada no shaila, that's going to be a schus for the ganze Olam, that will Be'ez Hashem be zeicha to give the shiurim this year for the Kallus in Eretz Yisrael. Be'ez Hashem. And that's mamish is, I can't think of any greater way to prepare for coming to Eretz Yisrael. Some people are preparing green cards, and some people are preparing their everything they're preparing, and the hotels and this. And we're preparing to get ready, that we should know the halacha, so that when we come here, we should know what to do, which shows the Heilige Bashefer, our incredible desire in Chukka to come to Eretz Yisrael. We're learning Torah Eretz Yisrael. The Chachmas Adam, he has a sefer called Shari Tzedek. In that sefer, he writes that I'm going to say all the halachas now of the mitzvahs atzluyas ba'aretz. Why? Because if I come to Eretz Yisrael, I have to be muchan when I'm in the Palter in Shel Melech, to know the taksisei malucha, to know exactly how you're supposed to act when you're inside the malucha, the malchus. A person that sits and learns the halachas of Shmita, he shows HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I want to come to Eretz Yisrael to be able to learn the Torahs of Eretz Yisrael, to be able to be mekayim, the mitzvahs atzluyas ba'aretz. I can't think of any greater schus. It's unbelievable schus, and I'm impressed beyond belief, until the amount that I was impressed today of the Olam that comes together to learn Torah. That's already one madrega. But lekach neitzart, that's the reason that you were created, was to learn Torah. But to learn dafka, the difficult sugis of Shmita, when in America they're not so negay right now, just showing the Rebbeinu Shalom, our ahava for Torah, and our ahava for Torah Eretz Yisrael, and our ahava for the Torah to come back to be in Eretz Yisrael, so that we should know the halachas when we'll get to Eretz Yisrael. And the etzim Torah l'shma, it's for sure a schus for us. It's a schus for the ganze Klal Yisrael. Certainly a schus for the Agudah, and certainly a schus for the Kallus to come to Eretz Yisrael this year. And Halavai will be zeicha. This is an understatement for the Olam. Number one. Number two is that as our sugya of Shmita, different parts, a little bit difficult, especially it's things that we're not used to. I'll try today, Be'ez Hashem, to the best of my ability, to make the sugya a little bit more tangible. Mitzad, number one, the sugya, and number one, to bring it into the halacha l'maisa. I heard already you were zeicha to have already Rabbi Frati and great go'inim and tzaddikim and Talmidei Chachamim. So I'm just a Yehuda v'oid lakra, just to learn together with the oilam, with the tzibur, like we always do, and maybe to just make a little bit practical, especially if we're going to come to Eretz Yisrael, what's going on in the hechsherim and what's going on out there. Let's see what we can get. I'm going to focus today on two topics that are betzim very related, which really in essence is the sheet of the B'datzei the Charedis, which is normally known as the best hechsher in Eretz Yisrael. I'm going to focus on what makes up the shita, the unique shita, I would say the more lenient shita, the more kuladik shita this year of the B'datz. What's it based upon? And what's the machlekes to not go like that shita? Just that the olam should know what's going on. How to be noig after it. You have to ask your shilas. These are very big shilas that they have one year that the hechsher that everybody wants to eat is one hechsher, and then comes another year and already there's pipukim and shilas. Let's just at least understand what's the nidain, what's the shilah. There are two separate shilas, and that's also part of the uniqueness of a year, and also part of the bilbul and the confusion. Many people think that the B'datz has a certain shita, a minig Yushalayim, and they think, well, I could go like the B'datz, and when in Rome, never do like a Roman. But when in Yerushalayim, you could do like the Yerushalayimers, you could do like the Yerushalmi. He thinks, I'll come to Eretz Yisrael and I'll eat the Charedis, which I'm never going to be the one that says you can't. But he has to know exactly what that shita is, and people think that it's one shaila, and that one shaila was the Minig Yerushalayim shaila. But there's not just one shaila, there's lots of shailas. So let's see exactly, really we'll focus on two shailas today. And let's see. One shaila is the borders of Eretz Yisrael, where exactly Eretz Yisrael is and where it extends to. And that, as you saw, I didn't give my Mekayim on because that sugya is extremely vast and difficult to give my Mekayim on. And that sugya I'll leave for the end, if there's time, we'll focus on that. What's included in Eretz Yisrael? We know that products that come from New York or that come from Europe are certainly, or Africa or Asia, are certainly not Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. Whereas products that come from Eretz Yisrael this year have a status of Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. What's the nafkamina if they're Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius? So the nafkamina is there's certain things that you're allowed to do with the peiros, certain ways you're allowed to use them. And most importantly, the nafkamina is you can't just throw them in the garbage when you finish with them. You have to be shaymer them. And you have to make sure that they don't get ruined. You might have to have a special Shmitta pack, a special Shmitta garbage, etc. So it's very important to know which what products this is going to apply to. Certainly products from New York, even a product from New York that comes to Eretz Yisrael, it does not apply to. It only applies to products grown in Eretz Yisrael. So the second part of the shiur at this time will be, what is Eretz Yisrael? What's called Eretz Yisrael? Not necessarily what you see on the map, which is called Medinat Yisrael, is Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it's bigger, maybe it's smaller, and we'll have to see. Maybe parts of Jordan are included in Eretz Yisrael. Maybe Eilat is not included in Eretz Yisrael. All these things, if this time, there's Hashem, I hope to go into. For that, it was hard to give my mekaymis, but let's see if this time the shaila will focus on that the Olam is learning Be'iyun is the shaila of what happens if the product in Eretz Yisrael is grown by a guy. It's owned by a guy. The product is owned by a guy. The land is owned by a guy, and it grows on goyish owned property. This is known in Eretz Yisrael as Yevul Nachri, products which are grown by goyim. There are many fields in Eretz Yisrael. Now, at this point, we'll talk about fields, let's say, that are for sure Eretz Yisrael. Let's say, the places that there are no sveikus about. Because afterward we'll see there's many places in the south and there's many places in the east that there are sveikus if they're a part of Eretz Yisrael. The first discussion is assuming that the place is in Eretz Yisrael. It's mamish in Yerushalayim, there's a field, but that field is owned by goyim. What's the status of that peri? What's the status of the fruits and the vegetables that grow out of such a place? Is it Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius? And therefore, you would have to be careful with it and make sure that if you eat it, you're allowed to eat it, but you'd have to make sure not to throw it out. At the end, if you have leftover, and you'd have to be shomer with the various rules, which that itself is an entire shiur. And there's rules about selling shvius products, and there's rules about taking shvius products to chutz la'aretz. So the first shaila that we want to dan is if we have products growing in Eretz Yisrael, which is for sure Eretz Yisrael, but the product is owned, the field at least, the production is owned by a guy. So what's the din of what's called Yevul Nachri? That's our sugya. What's the din of Yevul Nachri? Is it something that we could say maybe, just like New York doesn't have the Kedusha of Shvius, so maybe a product owned by a guy, the guy is like he's in New York. It takes away the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, and the product that grows on a ground that's owned by a guy, perhaps, is considered as if it grew in New York. And then if I have a leftover potato that originated from a goyish landowner, so then maybe I could take it and throw it out if I have leftover, because I don't have to watch it b'kedusha shvius, and maybe I'll be able to sell it. And this would be a great savior, because we got to have fruit. What are we going to eat? So for sure you can eat potatoes and tomatoes from Turkey. I want to know if Yasser and Muhammad have a field in Eretz Yisrael, can I just buy it from him? Maybe Yasser and Muhammad have a din of New York, and Mamela, you're allowed to eat the products that Yasser and Muhammad have grown on their field. That would be a great savior. And this, Rabbi Isai, is a very major shaila. It's a very major machlekes. It seems to be that it's always been a major machlekes for mamish hundreds of years. The products of Yevul Nachri, and there's a complication. What's the minig or not the minig? And this is something that Mitzvah Shem will talk about. Now, I want to make two akdamas. There are things we're not talking about today. The working on the ground, that's a separate isser. You're not allowed to work the ground in Eretz Yisrael during Shvius. That's a separate isser. And certainly, even if the land is owned by goyim, even if the land is owned by goyim, but certainly the guy, you have no right, a Jew could certainly not work that land. And I'm not going to talk today. Maybe that's where part of the controversy of Het Mechira comes in, but that's no shaila. The way we baskin is certainly, even if you would sell the land to a guy, you certainly can't work the land. We're not talking about that. We're talking about land that's owned by a guy, and we want to know if the product, the potato, tomato, grew on the goyish plantation or whatever, and now you get that product. Does it have kedusha shvius? That's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to focus bichlal on the hefker shaila, the laws of hefker and Shmitta right now, or the laws I'm working on the ground in Shmitta right now. The product in front of me is a Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius, and therefore I have to treat it properly. How do I have to treat it? Like we said, you might not be able to sell it. You might have to only sell it out of something else. If I'm buying a falafel, you'll be buying, like the Gemara in Sukkah says in Daf Lamed Tes, you'll pay for the pita, not for the vegetables. And when I finish it up, I won't be able to throw it in the garbage. So I want to know first, do I have in front of me a product which is Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius? Afterward, what the laws are, maybe a different share will give what exactly how you treat those products. Maybe that's an Andra Shvius. That's one thing which is very necessary akdama. A second very necessary akdama, Rabbi Yisai, is there is something called Svichim, as you heard from Rabbi Ganasman at the end. And this is extremely, extremely negate to understand it for the basis of today's shir and probably many of the shir. I'll just say, Bekitzer, there was a tkufa way back in the time of the Amoraim that there were people already in the Tanoim that they weren't already. It's not something new today. People that aren't treating Shmita properly. It's an old story that there were people that they were somehow the vegetable grew. Don't ask questions. There's cucumbers there. Don't ask. It grew on its own. But there were too many cucumbers that were growing on its own. So Chazal came along and they made an Isser Svichim, Midrabanan probably, the way we paskin, they made an Isser Svichim that they said, any vegetable, listen closely, Rabbi Yisai, this is one of the most important ideas that you'll have in all of Shmita, any vegetable that grows during the Shvius year, any vegetable that grows during Shmita, and we'll see if it means that it was also planted during Shmita, which is really the Shita of the Rash. The Rambam has more of a chumrah, but let's say the Rash Shita is anything that at least grew and was planted during the 7th year, whether it grew on its own or whether someone grew it. Chazal said it's treif, non-kosher, because of the avaryonim that were going and planting things and saying it grew on its own. Minat Torah is certainly things that grew on its own you'd be allowed to eat during Shemitah. But there were too many people doing shtick. So Mamela Chazal came along and said any vegetable that grows that at least was nizra during the 7th year is non-kosher. That means how are we going to have cucumbers this year? Because any cucumber, there's a din of the Gemara called svichim. Now, if you listen closely, I said it's only by vegetables, not by trees, not by fruits. Why? Very simple. Apples, Rabbi Yisai, we didn't have too many of our yonim that were planting a tree because anyways, you can't get usage out of this tree for until after the Shemitah year. So we didn't have too many of our yonim that were planting apple trees and orange trees because it wasn't worth it, bichlal. So the Mela, if you want to know, you go to a cousin or somebody and they have one of these shady things and they put in front of you cucumbers and apples. So right away, you know that the cucumbers that grew here in Eretz Yisrael, they're all non-kosher. And now we'll have to see in a moment, is there anything left? What are we going to eat? Like the pasuk says in Bahar. But if they put in front of you cucumbers, they're not kosher. And if those cucumbers go into a pot, and are cooked together, the food is not kosher, and the pot is not kosher. It's all not kosher, midrabanan, but it's non-kosher, 100% non-kosher. But an apple that's put in front of you, for example, so even if somebody illegally worked on the field, which they're for sure not allowed to do, so there's a machlekes. Do we say if somebody worked on a field and he wasn't allowed to, does it aser the apple? And it's a fight. Shlomo Zalman is machmir here. The Chazanish is more makel over here. And that's the derek klal, the psak halacha, that what's called shomor, the neved, a product that was worked upon or protected, the field was protected, so then you're not allowed to do that. But it doesn't necessarily aser the product. So if somebody puts in front of you cucumbers and apples during the Shemitah year, and you know it's coming from a shady place, you eat the apple. What we're talking about today, very, very important, Rabbi Yisai, is we're talking about Yevul Nachri, products that were grown in the field that's owned by a guy. Now, wait a minute. Where's the starting point before we discuss if it's Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius? We're not talking about apples. We're talking about cucumbers. We're talking about lettuce. We're talking about peppers. So didn't I just say that all the products that grow in Eretz Yisrael, all the vegetables that grow, they asered, and they said they're treif because of svichim. So this is the basis and the akdama for today's shir, is that Chazal made an isser of svichim, but not on goyish owned products. And that's the one thing which is not a fight. Everything else we'll talk about today is a fight. But everybody agrees that when a guy owns a field in Eretz Yisrael and he goes and plants cucumbers and tomatoes and lettuce, everyone agrees it's kosher. They didn't make an Isser Slichim on Goyisha owned products. Mistama, one of the reasons was because Goyisha planted products, because otherwise, what are we going to eat? The shaila that we're discussing today is that it's not treif, but does it have kedusha shvius? So that, Rabbi Yitzai, is our starting point. The vegetables that stam grew in Eretz Yisrael, whether they're hefker or they grew by a Jew, are non-kosher this year. Number one. The vegetables that are planted by a guy, they are kosher this year. Now our question is, what's the din? Do they have a kedusha shvius, or does the guy, when he owns the land in Eretz Yisrael, take away the kedusha shvius, and then the nafkamina, like we spoke, is all the nafkaminas that you have to learn about. You're not allowed to sell it so pashit. You're not allowed to mevaz it. You have to be careful with it, and you won't be able to just throw it in the garbage, etc., etc. That's a very necessary akadama. Now, let's go into the sugya. What I'm going to focus on today, mostly, Rabbi Yitzai, these are difficult sugyas, and these are sugyas which you can learn. Arichas Noira Mamish, to learn Yerushalmi Shmitta, you need a ganze Shmitta, a whole 7 years to learn. I'm going to focus today through the sugya on a specific shaila. What's the minig Yerushalayim? What is the minig Yerushalayim? And the Olam that wants to come to Yerushalayim as children in Yerushalayim could be soymech on the minig Yerushalayim. What's the minig Yerushalayim? And let me explain this. There's a Gemara in Gittin on Daf Mem Zayin, very famous Gemara. The Olam learned it when they were Bachrim in Yeshiva, and now we're making you learn it again because you're again Bachrim in Yeshiva. And the Gemara over there has a very big machlekes. Is Yesh Kinyan Biyad Akum? Does the guy have a Kinyan in Eretz Yisrael to take away from the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael? Now, everybody says you can never take away from the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And Avada, like I said before, the land itself you can't work on. And if a guy owns the land, a Jew can't work there during Shmita. No shaila. Doesn't halacha. However, our shaila is the payers that grew, maybe when the guy owns the land, it creates that the land does not have produce that comes out of it with the kedusha of Shmita. And it's like produce that grew in America. It seems to be, this is not just a shaila in Shmita. It's a shaila to have to take trumas and maestras from produce that is owned by goyish lands, Yevul Nachri. From this point on, I'll call it Yevul Nachri. Trumas and maestras is also shaila. If yesh kinyan b'yad akum, if the guy has the ability to be mafkiya, so then Yevul Nachri, you don't have to take trumas and maestras. It's New York. If ein kinyan b'yad akum, if the guy doesn't have the ability to take out the kedusha, so then avada you need trumas and maestras, and avada in a regular year, and an avada in a shmita year, it's hefker. In a Shmita year, it's Hefker. If it would be Ein Kinyan, then this year it's Hefker. And this year it's also Kaddish, and you would have to treat it with the proper Kedusha. You learn the Gemara in Gittin, it's almost unanimous. 99% of the Rishayin and Paiskim over there, Ayin Sham, they all say Ein Kinyan B'Yad Akum. The guy has no ability to remove from the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And if that's the case, it's case closed. That means you could buy from a guy because the guy doesn't have an isser to sell it. He doesn't have any mitzvahs except for the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Even that he probably doesn't care about. But the guy could sell the produce, and the isser of schleira on produce is an isser on the seller. So I could buy from the guy straight, but you'd have to be Noach Kedusha. You yourself would not be allowed to sell it to somebody else. You would have to be careful with it. And that's what seemingly comes out of the Gemara, that Ein Kinyan B'Yad Akum, to be mafkiya from the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. That's what you would have came out with when you learned the Gemara and Gittin Daf Mem Zayin. The big shaila is Sviv the Rambam. This Rambam, Rabbi Yisai, it's unbelievable. Everybody brings this Rambam. The Mekilim say the Rambam is a raya to me. The Machmirim say the Rambam is a raya to me. Everything is the Rambam. It's unbelievable. This Rambam, the Shita already speaks out. He says, look, there's a lot of other Shitas out there, Rashi and whatever, that clearly hold that Avada, the guy ain't Kinyan, and the Peiris are Kaddish, and you have to be careful with them. That's most of the Rishonim, everybody. But the Rambam, with the Geis HaKoyach of the Heilige Rambam, he shakes the world, the Rambam. He says the Psak, everybody wants to know, what's the Rambam's Psak, even if it'll be against everybody else. The Rambam is in Dalid Chavtes in Shmita v'Yovel, and the Rambam says Goy shekana karka b'Eretz Yisrael. This is tailor-made. A goy that bought land in Eretz Yisrael. V'zara b'shvius. And he goes and he plants in the 7th year. Peirosein mutarim. And the Frankel Rambam makes he says a period over here. Shaloi gozru al asvichin, because they were never guys on Svichim, right? So comes along the Kesef Mishnah, in a very long Kesef Mishnah over here, and he says, this Rambam is very sussum. It sounds like a guy that bought land in Eretz Yisrael in the Shmitta year, and he buys land, the payers are mutter. Says the Kesef Mishnah, it sounds like not only are they mutter from Svichim, not only are they not treif, what I mentioned before that everybody agrees to, but it sounds like mutter. It sounds like you could do what you want with them. That's how the Kesef Mishnah learns this Rambam. He has a big arichas over here because he has a very big problem. He says, how can I say that the payers are not kaddish b'kedusha shvius? I can understand they're not svichim, like we explained before. But how could you say that they don't have kedusha shvius on them? So as you see over here, there's a long arichas in the Kesef Mishnah. And just to paraphrase, and to make a long story short, because a Mishnah comes out with a phenomenal, unique pshat in the Gemara. He learns Ein Kinyan B'Yad Akum is only after the goy is not in the karka. Kol zman the goy is in the karka, for sure the goy is mafkiya from the kedusha, and for sure the payers, for example, are not going to be kaddish b'kedusha shvius. I'm not going to go into the pshat of the Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam, because I'm focusing today on let's get to the minig. But basically what the Kesef Mishnah says is the answer to our shaila is payers that grew Yevul Nachri is not Svichim and not Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. It's like you're in New York. How you deal with the Gemara? I in the Kesef Mishnah. Das is Rabbi Say, Oisgebracht again in the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Shin Lamed Aleph in Yeridea, in Siv Zayin. Over there, I'll read you the Lashon. I have a Shulchan Aruch over there. Shin Lamed Aleph is the whole sugya of Trumas and Maisus. Shulchan Aruch says that Malcha Goy Yisrael Paris, excuse me. Yeah, well, it's a little bit complicated because the Rambam over here is not talking about Shmitta, he's talking about Trumas and Maisus, but like I explained to you, it's the same sugya. So Malcha Goy Yisrael Paris am Chubarim. So he says, Einam chayovim b'trumas maisis. Hoyelu ba lo'oinas amaisis b'shus hagoy. Says the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, if the pre grew in Eretz Yisrael by the goy, no din trumas maisis. Same story. Same story. And so too, in the Shmita year, no din Shmita, which would make Rabbi say, so easy this year, not so easy, but a little bit easier. A lot of the karka in Eretz Yisrael is owned by goyim, and I don't mean this with metata mechira. I mean it's owned by goyim kipshutai. It's owned by goyim. So now see this, it's great if this is the psak halacha. I could buy from goyim, I could eat the potatoes, and I could throw them in the garbage when I finish, and I could sell them if I have a fruit store and a vegetable store, and it's very, very smooth and very, very simple. And you should know Rabbi Yisai. When the dust settles, which we'll get to in a moment, this is the psak of the Eidach Haredis to Badatz. The Eidach Haredis Badatz holds that vegetables that are owned by goyim, the field, the Yevul Nachri, doesn't have kedusha shvius, and like we said before, it's certainly not tzvich. Now, by saying, what's the minig? The Badatz Eidach Haredis obviously holds that that's the minig Yerushalayim, which we have to come to and figure out where that came from, and that's how they sell their product. Right? What's taka the minig? You look over here in the Gra on the page, and the goyim has a very big arichas over here, but just the startling words of the Vilna Goyim, it's unbelievable. The Goyim says, Kivat, you can't read the words, but the Goyim says it. The Goyim says, it's a shkoga gedoyla. The Goyim writes that this is a terrible mistake of the Kesef Mishnah, and he says, it's dvarim temuim, and he has a long arichas over here, the Goyim, to argue on the Beis Yosef. Now, what's going on over here? 250 years or 300 years later, after the Beis Yosef, came along a great Jew, the Pas HaShulchan. The Pas HaShulchan was Yisrael Mishklov, and the names here are very important. There's actually a street, whoever knows, in Harnov called Mishkalov. Yisrael Mishklov was one of the great Talmidim of the Goyim, and he writes over there in his Pas HaShulchan, he has a kuntris, a 7-page kuntris, discussing this topic, He said, I come to Eretz Yisrael, the Talmidei Agra that were Zeicha to come to Eretz Yisrael, and I want to know, can I buy from the Goyish produce? I can for sure buy, but I want to know, can I sell it? And does it have Kedusha Shvius? He has 7 pages to prove, like the Beis Yosef, against the kachas of a lot of the Poiskim and Rishonim against the Beis Yosef. At the end, he writes in this contrast, and you know what? I came here now, and who was the Mora of Eretz Yisrael? Who was the Rebbe of all of Eretz Yisrael? Maran Bet Yosef. So I beside, that's the Minig Eretz Yisrael, he says, because look, if the Beis Yosef was the one that said it, Istama was the Minig Eretz Yisrael, and Ibazai, he says, therefore, that's the Minig, and therefore you could be Saimich that Yevul Nachri has no Kedusha Shvius. Adkan, the Basa Shulchan. Now it's very interesting. The Basa Shulchan is the Talmud of the Gra. In the Kedama of the Basa Shulchan, he writes Shamati from Elio, Reb Elio, that's the Goin, B'Shem Elio Anovi, B'Shem Yaakov Avinu. I mean, we see how much Rabbi Yisrael Mishlav held of his Rebbe the Goin. Afa Bikain, he argues on his Rebbe the Goin. His Rebbe the Goin held that, we'll see in a moment, the Paris of Yevul Nachri absolutely have Kedusha Shvius, and that the Psak of the Gemara in Gittin is Chai V'Kayim, Ein Kinyin B'Yad Akum. A guy doesn't have the ability to take away from the Kedusha, and the Paris are Kadosh B'Kedusha Shvius. Came along the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Isai, and he brings down, now the truth is it's Murdik, you're sitting behind the picture, I'm sitting behind the picture of the Chazon Ish. You should know, in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Isai, in Shmitta, before the Chazon Ish, Shmitta was a Meis Mitzvah. Shmitta was something, it was a thing of the past. And if you look a little in the history books, maybe one time we could talk about the history. But anybody that knows about the history in Shmitta, Kimat, by the Aliyah Rishayin and Shnia, Kimat, those that were in charge in Eretz Yisrael, made it Kimat illegal to hold of Shmitta. And the Shmitta was a Meis mitzvah. So, you know, this mitzvah is the chiddush of the Chazon Ish. He deserves to be sitting behind me. And that's why a lot of the psakim, I know always by Rav Elyashiv, was the Chazon Ish, the Chazon Ish, the Chazon Ish, the Chazon Ish. Because without the Chazon Ish, nothing starts in Eretz Yisrael. It's mamish the Pesha Aser. He's the Pesha Hitter, and he's the Pesha Aser, and he's the Pesha Hitter. So let's see. The Chazon Ish come along over here, and he brings down that the Basa Shulchan says that the minig of Yerushalayim, minig Eretz Yisrael, is to have Yevul Nachri and treat them like they're from Chutz La'aretz. Sell it, do what you want with it, and treat it how you want. He says, look, in the time of the Beis Yosef, who argued strong against the Beis Yosef? Everyone knows the Mabit. The Mabit was the big fighter against this psak, and he held that Yevul Nachri is like the Gemara, and Yesh Ein Kinyan B'Yad Goyim, and Memela it has the Kedusha Shvius. He says, so I want to know now what's the minig. Says the Chazon Ish, you come a few years later, and the Charedim, this is already the door after the Beis Yosef, you know, and the door after the Beis Yosef and the Mabit. I guess the Beis Yosef and the Mabit, they had a fight about this. So what became the minig Eretz Yisrael? He says, look, the door after is the Charedim. In the door after of the Charedim says that the minig in Eretz Yisrael is not like the Beis Yosef. He said the minig is to treat the stuff like Kedusha Shvius. And he goes so far as to say, look, we treat it like Kedusha Shvius. Now, this is an unbelievable war, Rabbi Isai, because if you're going to treat it like Kedusha Shvius, what you're reading here, thank you, very good. You guys put it up. You guys are gewaldig. If you're going to treat it like Kedusha Shvius, he says, also, you don't need to take Trumas and Maestras from it, because Avivait that it's Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius, so then that means that it's Hefker. If it's Hefker we know doesn't need Trumas and Maestras. And therefore, he writes the words that you're seeing over here on the screen, the Kain Amadvar. That's the minig. So the Chazon Ish says, so why is the Basa Shulchan coming along 250 years later and saying the minig is like the Beis Yosef? You see in the door right after the Beis Yosef that people were not being noyig with the Yevul Nachri, that it was Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. The next door, says the Chazon Ish. The door after the Charedim, that's already the door of the Shlo Kimat. Comes along the Shlo says, look, if I want to not be Noig Shvius, I'll stay in Prague. I'm coming to Eretz Yisrael, says the Shlo in Ois Kuf. You know, the Oisius, the Shlo has a sefer based on Oisius. In Ois Kedusha, Ois Kuf, the Shlo says, now that I came to Eretz Yisrael, you should know that Paris of Yevul Nachri have a din of Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. And he writes over there, and Cain is the minig. He saws over there, the minig was that they were Hefker, and people didn't take Trumas and Maestras from them. So Memela, that's the minig. This is the minig. And the Chazon Ish says something extremely, extremely strong. He says that we are all trying to figure out what's pshat in the Rambam. The Rambam, the Pashup pshat in the Rambam, says the Mapit, is Goyish Kona Karka Beretz Yisrael. The pairs are mutarim. He just means mutar, that it's not tzvichim. But he doesn't say anywhere it's not Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. How do you know that your pshat in the Rambam is right? Maybe the Beis Yosef says in the Kesef Mishnah not like this. So the Chazon Ish says, go and look in the Rambam in the Perador. The Perador in Ois Tesvav, that's the Rambam's Chuvas. The Rambam says over there, a cheshbon, I'll say bekitzer, it's a little bit of a cheshbon. He says, if Svichim would have been deraisa, then we would have made Svichim even by the Goyish owned fields. But now that Svichim is the Rabbanon, we didn't. Said the Chazon Ish, Goyish owned fields making Svichim, whoa. Goyim, it's like in New York. They're mufka from the whole thing. How in the world could you say that if Svichim would have been deraisa, we would have also said it by the Goyim. By the Goyim, there's no Shmitta, there's no anything by Goyim. Says the Chazon Ish, it says Mefurish in the Rambam that Yevul Nachri does have Kedusha Shvius. And if Svichim would have been deraisa, we would have even made Svichim. But since Svichim is the Rabbanan, so we didn't make Svichim. But there is Kedusha Shvius. And the Chazon Ish says, Moira de Gerade, he says, if the Patzah Shulchan would have seen this, he never would have said this is the minhag. He would have been chayzer. Maybe the Kesef Mishnah would have been chayzer. And this was the great war that the Chazon Ish staged against this, we'll see in a moment, so-called minhag Yerushalayim, that Yevul Nachri has a din of Shvius. Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. The Chazon Ish says it does. And the Eidech HaRav says, no, we all like the Patzah Shulchan. Yerushalayimers were Talmidim of the Gra, not Talmidim of the Gra himself. We're Talmidim of the Gra, the Patzah Shulchan, and we're Talmidim of the Beis Yosef. This is a world war. The Chidah, where do the Sfardim get involved? The Chidah says, I don't know, Chuvas HaRambam, I don't know, says the Chidah, I don't have a Beis Yosef, I don't have this, I have a Chuvas HaRambam. We know the Chuvas HaRambam is called the Avkas Roichel. The Chuvas HaRambam is called the Avkas Roichel. He called it Ksav Yad. The Chidah had Ksav Yad from the Heilige Beis Yosef. Listen to Amar de Gezach.
You mean Chuvas HaBeis Yosef, not Chuvas HaRambam.
Chuvas HaBeis Yosef, excuse me. He says, I found Chuvas from the Beis Yosef, excuse me. We know those Chuvas are called the Avkas Roichel, but the Chidah had Chuvas of the Beis Yosef. So listen to a Davar Nifla.
Put it up, Pesach.
Sorry? I said it again.
No. We're putting it up so I could see it.
Very good. He says, I have Chuvas Beis Yosef. You look in the Chuvas Beis Yosef, which we call the Avkas Roichel. And over there he says that Raisi, Ra'isav, Bakunchasim, Loi Mirali, I argue on the Mabit, and Yesh Baraisa Kedei Levatel, the Minig Shalai Nagu. And he says, you should know, the Mashahevi Raya, Ein Moichrin, Loikrin, I don't believe any of that. Dainu Dafka Pershe Godlu, he says, I don't believe in any of this. And Tachlis, Kols Man Shehi B'Yad Goy Mufkehi, Umasha Pereseh Chayiv B'Maiser, is Ein Ella B'Shmiras in Yisrael. The Kitzer said the Chidah, I have a tshuva explicitly that in the year Shin Lamed Daled, that's the most important part, says the Chidah, that we know the year was a year of Shmitta, and in Shin Lamed Daled, I know that the Beis Yosef says, I was noyig Shmitta kefi my psak, that Yevul Nachri is not Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. Now, Boisai, this Chidah is very, very a monumentous Chidah, because the Charedim said, which I don't want to go into the Raya now, but the Charedim said that the Beis Yosef was Chayzer even b'Seif Yamav, and maybe even in the Shulchan Aruch. It's a difficult Raya why the Charedim says the Beis Yosef is Chayzer. But the Chidah says, here, look in front of you. You see for sure one thing. The Beis Yosef wasn't Chayzer. He wrote his Sefer Shulchan Aruch before this, and in Shin Lamed Daled, after he wrote the Sefer Shulchan Aruch, he's still holding strong with his Shita that Yevul Nachri is not Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. So the Chazon Ish says, okay, so we got to make a printing error over here. We have to say the Shin Lamed Daled wasn't Shin Lamed Daled. It was really Shin Chav Zayin, and it was the Shmita before. And the Shulchan Aruch was published in the interim, in Shin Lamed, and in Shin Lamed, the Charedim has a raya from Shulchan Aruch and Sifyut Tes, which is a little bit difficult to go into over there in Sifyut Tes. If you understand, good. If not, it's also okay. And he says, in Sifyut, in Sif, excuse me, it's difficult to go into because I don't remember where it was. In Sif, I think Yud Tes, yeah. In Sifyut Tes, the Shulchan Aruch brings down that fruits, vegetables that grow during Shmitta, you don't have to take meiser from. And it doesn't differentiate between a goy and a Jew. So the Charedim says, you see, he was chayzer. It's a bit of a chiddush, and there's a reason I'm being bekitzer about it. But the fight between the Chidah and the Chazon Ish was the Beis Yosef chayzer? The Chidah says, no way. And the Chazon Ish says, he was. Ad Kan Rabbi Yisai is a little bit of history. So what's the Minhag Yerushalayim? What's the Minhag Yerushalayim? Is Rabbi Yisai, who do you got to go to find out the Minhag Yerushalayim? You got to go back to the Maral Diskin. No, he was the big Rebbe in Yerushalayim. No, he came from Brisk. What was the Maral Diskin? No, you said that was Mistama. If today you see, look, Rabbi Yisai, let me explain to you. If you want to come to Yerushalayim today and know what's the Minhag Yerushalayim, there's clearly Yerushalayim and Mishpachas for 200 years that have been noyeg like the Pasach Shulchan and like the Beis Yosef, and certainly Svardish Mishpachas like the Chidah, that it's not Kaddish. You can do what you want with it. My question is, though, let's try to find where exactly it came from, because the Chazon Ish said the Pasach Shulchan had no right to do this, and the Shloh says it's not true, we didn't do like the Beis Yosef, and the Charedim says they didn't do like that, we all did like the Mabit. So what happened here? So maybe, I guess, the Maral Diskin came along, and he said, let's do like the Pasach Shulchan. Very interesting. I couldn't find any Maral Diskin, but I found a very interesting tshuva, Rabbi Yisai. There's a tshuva called from the Zeicher Simcha. Who's the Zeicher Simcha? Simcha Bamberger. Now, Rabbi Yisai, what's the name of our friend over here by Bamberger? His name is Simcha? Must be an anical, no? Simcha Bamberger. There was a great Rav in Europe 150 years ago, and his name was Simcha Bamberger. And he has a sefer called the Zeicher Simcha. In that sefer, he has a shayla. Somebody sent him an esrog from Eretz Yisrael to Europe. So he writes the tshuva to a Rav in Eretz Yisrael, who I'm not saying his name. That's what he writes there. The big goyin in Eretz Yisrael, I'm not saying who it is. I have this esrog, and he says, I don't know what to do with this. I mean, what is this thing? They sent me an esrog. They told me they bought it from the goyim. Is it Shmitta? And then how did they send it? You're not allowed to send it to Chutz La'aretz. And what do I do now with it? Do I have to wrap it up? Or is it not Shmitta? What do I do? What do I do? So this big Rav from Eretz Yisrael, we don't know who he is. He writes back to the Zeicher Simcha, look, I'm not going to be moicha. They don't anyways listen to me. And it's esroigim, and it's the moicher, and it's his parnasa, and whatever. But, you know, I'm not so clear about this thing. I think Yiful Nachri maybe does have Kedusha Shvias, but I'm not going to be moicha. And that's how he ends the tshuva. There's another tshuva called the Shem Sheris. He brings down that from the Maril Diskin. And when you put this tshuva together with the Zeicher Simcha, you see it's one tshuva. Shnei chaloim es chaloim echad heim. And he brings down over there the same l'shonos. I'm not going to be moicha. I don't, you know, there's a moicher esrog. He needs his parnasa. It seems that the Maral Diskin himself did not so much hold of this minhag. He wasn't moicha. I mean, these are big names, Rabbi Yisai. It's hard to be moicha. The Rabbi Tzina Abishol writes, the Svardim are meiko on this shaila. And he says, if you want to be machmer, do it b'tzina. If you want to go and wrap up the food and put it in your shmita pach, make sure no one's looking. Big names, Rabbi Yisai. Chidah, Havkes Roichel, Beis Yosef, Kesef Mishnah, maybe a Rambam. No, I'm not going to be moicha. But if it sounds like the Maral Diskin, if you would ask him, he went with the Chazon Ish. He went with the Mabit, with the Charedim, with the Shloh, that it does have Shvius. Who else is there? Or Shmuel Salant, I don't know about Rabbi Yisai. What about Rav Yosef Chaim? He writes in Samos Chaim, don't be moicha. Sounds like he didn't like it so much. The Sameach and the Chuvas, he says, I'm not going to object. So that's why I don't want people to know, because I don't want to take away from the parnasa of the Esroigim moichrim. They won't be able to sell Esroigim. I'm not going to object. So I'll just write in my Chuvas. The Sameach says, who reads my Chuvas anyways? They read the Meshachach. So Rabbi Yisai, what's Lemaisa? Lemaisa, you got to ask a Shiloh. Because when you're going to come to Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yisai, are you going to be eating Eidach Haredis? Does a person have a right to be Seimach on this Minhag Yerushalayim? Mistama. There's definitely a lot of people for the last 200 years have been knowing this. Rosh Hashanah held the Minhag Yerushalayim is a Minhag Yerushalayim, and certainly in Yerushalayim, Rosh Hashanah held, you can be Seimach on the Minhag Yerushalayim. like the Kesef Mishnah, like the Avkas Reichel, like the Chida, Rav Yashiv, Paskin on this Shaila, you have to be machmir like the Chazon Ish. And the Paris, you can buy them, but you can't be noyig, shaloi b'kedusha shvius. Okay. In most of Eretz Yisrael, the Chazon Ish was niskabel. The Charedis doesn't hold like that. If you read a product from the Charedis, that's what I'm in the middle of finding out, but it seems to be you'll be able to know if you'll be able to buy it, because are you going to say, how does he have a right to sell it? So I said, wait, let's go slow. He has a right to sell it because he is his Rabbanim, hold you could sell it. The Yisser is on the Meicher, so he could sell it because he could sell it. I could buy it from him because there's no Yisser on me. I'm only the buyer. The Yisser Schayra is only on the seller. Elamai, you'll say Lifnei Iver. How can you say I'm being Lifnei Iver by letting him sell it? He's Saimech on the Beis Yosef. He's Saimech on the Chida. Leave me alone. He's Saimech on the Basa Shulchan. So if you want to buy it, then you could be Mekel on for sure. And then you buy it and you'll know you get Kedusha Shvius. And if you don't want to get a Shmitta Pach and you want to be a little bit machmir, so you buy it and you wrap it up before you throw it in the garbage, and then you throw it in the garbage. So that's a Baisai part one. Part one, and that you should know is what's called the Minig Yerushalayim. Now, Baisai, in the last years, and this is a sugya which I will not be able to necessarily, I suppose we'll say, do justice to, right? But I'll just give you I'll touch the surface on this topic, right? When you hear the word Minig Yerushalayim, that you just heard is a tremendous machlekes. Shlomo Zalman was Mekel, the Badatz is Mekel, Rav Yashiv was Machmir, the Chazon Ish was Machmir. Could you buy it? I told you could buy it. If you want to be Machmir, so just be Machmir to eat everything on your plate. That's a great chumrah. And not to throw out if there's leftover bits, so then wrap it up and put it in the garbage. That's the extent of the chumrah. That's a Minig Yerushalayim, and that's clearly, there is a Minig Yerushalayim, it's clearly a very old machlekes. The problem is there's a totally different machlekes which has come in to play, that the Badatz, the Charedis, is Mekel on, which they have every right to be Mekel on. But people make a mistake and assume, well, on that first machlekes, I'm Mekel. Okay, Shlomo Zalman was Mekel, and and that's an old fight. I'm Mekel. There's another fight which is totally unrelated and has not been a debate, certainly not for the last 500 years, and certainly has not been a minig to be Mekel on this shaila. And it's a shaila that only in the last 20, 30 years have a lot of the tzibur been Mekel on, and the Badatz is Mekel. But let's understand what that's shaila. And that shaila, Rabbi Sai, is not a shaila of Kaddish or not Kaddish. That's a shaila of Svichim or not. That's a shaila of kosher or not kosher. So now we need to know, what's the shaila? That shaila is where is Eretz Yisrael extend to? What are considered the borders of Eretz Yisrael? This is one of the most difficult topics in all of halacha. If we're going to establish today that the border is, let's say, somewhere, underneath that is not Eretz Yisrael, so then you're in New York, and even Jews could plant there, and even Jews could have the produce there, and everything is kosher, and nothing is Shmitta, and everything like that. But if you'll have a machlekes, and somebody's going to come along and say, no, that area over there, that is Eretz Yisrael. So then if there's a Jew there planting, and products coming from a Jew, we're no longer in Nachri. Now we're with Jews. And if a Jew's going to plant there, and a Jew's going to bring the produce, so then that produce, Rabbi Yisai, if it's vegetables, it's going to be svichim. So here you have a machlekes on where is Eretz Yisrael, and the ramifications are unbelievable, because here it's not enough to say, okay, I'll buy it, then I'll be noyek b'shvius. If you disagree and say the border of Eretz Yisrael extends to that area also, so then what you just said is that if there's Jews working there and bringing the produce, and this guy's got langa payas and he goes to the mikveh every day, and he's bringing it, and he's the one who's bringing it, if you hold that that's Eretz Yisrael, so then you hold that he's selling you svichim and you can't eat that, that's not kosher. What's this machlekes? Totally different machlekes. This is not the Minig Yerushalayim. If somebody wants to say, I'm holding in the Minig Yerushalayim, that was the first machlekes. This is a totally different machlekes. What is this machlekes? To establish the borders is extremely complicated. We have no clarity. First of all, we know there was a koivish of Oile Bavel and Oile Mitzrayim. There was Yeshua was koivish Eretz Yisrael, and then they came back when Ezra was koivish Eretz Yisrael. So we do know that it seems to be that the Oile Bavel did leave certain areas, not Kaddish, at least Klape Svichim. There are certain areas that Mitzrayim, the Oile Mitzrayim captured, and there are certain areas that Oile Bubble captured, and there are certain areas that Oile Bubble said, we're not going to be Makadish those areas that we captured, in order not to make in those areas an Isser of Svichim, so that the people should have what to eat. Does anybody know what these areas are? This is the very difficult thing. Number one. Number two, does anybody know at what point the Oile Mitzrayim, their Kibbush ends? Does it end by Yeshua? Does it end by David? Does it end by Shlomo? Shlomo got all the way to Taiwan, Kimat, So that's one question, which is, of course, is almost built in Mochra. There's another Shaila, is how long does the Oile Bubble extend for? Does it extend just to Ezra? Some say it extends to Yanai Melech, and some say it's to Hordus. So these are all very difficult. And to establish the border, it's almost minanimna. It's almost very, very difficult. There's fights about, is Aza, Ashkelon, is that a part of the border? When you read the Torah says Yam HaMelech. So maybe I'll just take a line from Yam HaMelech and go upward to where Aza is. And then everything under is not Eretz Yisrael. These rabbis are extremely, extremely difficult fights. Very, very difficult fights. Another thing very important is that if I could say the border is, let's say, Yam HaMelech, so everything on the other side is now Jordan. If everything is on the other side and everything is considered Jordan, Yarden, so then you have to know, Rabbi Yisai, there's no Svichim on the other side, but it might still be Kaddish B'Kedusha Shvius. Because even though, like I mentioned before, it could be on Jordan, maybe we know that Ezra was not Makadish that area. Okay, so there's no Svichim, but it's not so simple. Maybe he only said there's no Svichim, but maybe you're not allowed to work that area. This is all the complicated parts. To make this practical, watch. To make this practical, so comes along some of the Paiskim, great Paiskim, and they declare this holds of these Paiskim. And they say, listen, first, there's two different fights. There's the western fight, and there's the eastern side fight. So comes along some Paiskim, and they say, well, the border of Eretz Yisrael goes basically till a little bit past Ashkelon. Now, Paiskim, we have no clear Kabbalah on that. And then there are some Paiskim that are saying that I could take vegetables from that area over there. This is known as the Negev HaMarav, areas between Ashkelon and Aza. I mean, you can't get into Aza these days, and I don't think anybody really wants to go into Aza these days. But you'll take fruit and vegetables from there, and you'll say, that's not Eretz Yisrael. This Rabbi Isai said to Chazon Ish, who could say such a thing? Who could know such a thing? Who could have any idea where the border extended till? Another fight goes on to the other side of Yam HaMelech. Comes along, some great Paiskim, and they say, okay, from Yam HaMelech, the end. That's the border of Eretz Yisrael. Now let's make a line up, and that's it. Says the Chazon Ish, first of all, who knows such a thing, number one. Number two, said the Chazon Ish, and maybe Yam HaMelech, Niskatnu Ashiurim, Rabbi Yisai, maybe Yam HaMelech also got smaller. Now, I'm reading a question here. What about Eilat? So Rebbe Yashiv went with the Psak, which was based on the Kaftor V'Ferach, that the Kaftor V'Ferach writes that Eretz Yisrael goes from 30 to 35, which means under 30 is not Eretz Yisrael. That's what's called the Arava Dromi, the southern Arava. That area, it seems that the Rebbe Yashiv, not Rebbe Yashiv, it seems the Chazon Ish, and certainly Rebbe Yashiv held, that area is not Eretz Yisrael, which would make Yatavata and Eilat not a part of Eretz Yisrael, which means that the Machlekes is not on that. You can have Jews working down there, and that's not Eretz Yisrael, and we're Gevaldik. The fight is basically about an hour and a half from Yerushalayim till about 4 hours down. Those 2 hours and a half, that's the fight. That's the fight. Is that a part of Eretz Yisrael? Is that a part of Eretz Yisrael? And this big shilas of Baisai, where do I drop the line when I'm coming down from Yam HaMelech? Do I drop it straight? The Badat says, no, you can drop it a little bit that way. And the male of this area over here is now in Jordan. If it's in Jordan, so then, very good. There's no Svichim, and maybe it's not a part of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, and that's the Shita of the Eidach HaRedis. Rav Yashiv held that the products that are coming from there, when they drop the line over there, Rav Yashiv says, how do you know how to drop the line? Maybe you have to drop the line like this. If you have to drop the line like this, and then the product that's growing over there, Rabbi said, this is not a Shiloh of Yibul Nachri. This is not a shaila if it's being grown by a guy. This is a shaila that's being grown by a Jew. They say it's not Eretz Yisrael. Yashiv says it is Eretz Yisrael. If Yashiv is saying it is Eretz Yisrael, so then at least a suffix. Everyone agrees there might be a suffix. But if it's Eretz Yisrael, then it's Svichim. If it's Svichim, then it's not kosher. This Rabbi Isai is an absolute world war. Mamish world war. There are shmuas that Rosh Shlomo Zalman was makel on a lot of these shilas also. But you have to remember, a lot of the shilas that they asked Rosh Shlomo Zalman were 30 years ago, and there's a lot of new shilas. They say Rosh Shlomo Zalman was makel because he said, look, Shvius Bizman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. And if Shvius Bizman Hazeh D'Rabbanan, so Safek D'Rabbanan, there's L'kula. No, they say Rav Yashiv, when it was told, maybe Safek D'Rabbanan L'kula, Rav Yashiv said, but there's a suffix here, there's a suffix here, suffix here. But Saif, we're not going to have anything left in Eretz Yisrael. There won't be Eretz Yisrael left at all. Sounds like a leftist government. No, so you can't say suffix here, because something has to give over here. Number one. Number two, maybe it's only not because the suffix. It's a suffix. Okay. Maybe Shmitta. The dina of Shmitta are neveya from deraisa. So maybe even though today it's the Rabbanan, but you have to dan the shaila as if it's deraisa because the makor of the sveikus is a deraisa. So this is a tremendous war, Rabbi Yisai. Of the biggest machlekes. I just tell you, when you come to Eretz Yisrael and you say, okay, so I'll eat padatz because the minig Yerushalayim, you should know. The first thing is the minig Yerushalayim. The second thing is a machlekes of paiskim, that the paiskim on the badatz are mekel on. Right? I'm not even sure if Moshe Shterberg's mekel, but the paiskim are mekel. And the second shaila, you can't say was an old minig Yerushalayim. Number one, because it's a new shaila, it's a new fight. Number two is it's a shaila of kashrus, it's a shaila of kosher treif. Now I must tell you, and I mean this with the greatest sincerity, I think Rosh Shlomo Zalman was maybe mekel. I think Rav Yashiv was machmir. They say that Rav Chaim is machmir. Chaim is the Mishnah Berurah on Shmitta. That's a big shaila. My point is one thing. On this, you're not going to say, well, I'll be mekel because it's a minig Yerushalayim. This is just a regular machlekes of paiskim. You have to ask your paiskim what he's mekel. If he's mekel, you could eat it. But this is not the old fight. Now I'm seeing over here a nice shaila. Maybe if I'll get a guy to plant to own in that area, it'll be a sveika. Suffix maybe Yevul Nachri is anyways kosher. Suffix if the HaRav is a part of Eretz Yisrael. No, that's what to talk about. Rav Yashiv had other kulas. Rav Yashiv had kulas that greenhouses is a shtickle of shaila in the first place because it's in a bias, you're growing something in a bias, but it's a bias which is very good for the produce. So Rav Yashiv was mitzaref many things. If you sell the greenhouse to a guy, but a real mechira, not like at the mechira, like an emistic mechira, and it's metaltal and it's not karka, which you're allowed to sell to goyim. And you put plastic under the vegetables, which make it in otzitz, ein a nakiv. So the Yashiv, those greenhouses, the products that come out of them are kosher, and they have no kedusha shvius on them, and even in the HaRav, and that's what goes on. Not even not in the HaRav, they'll plant them everywhere in Eretz Yisrael. My Rabbi Frati. That's what his hechsher holds of. But Rabbi Isai, I think we're coming to an end on the sugya. What you see today, Rabbi Isai, this is a grace sugya. That means there's a bag of lettuce that somebody showed me today, and it says it was made in the HaRav Svoni, the northern HaRav, and it has a badatz on it. And you should know, when I looked into it, it's something that has been planted already. I knew some things that you're getting from the HaRav, they were planted last year. No, so then they're not svichim and they're not a problem. And they're not yet shvius, they're not yet shmita. Somebody comes to my backyard and tries to take one of my pomegranates off of him, he's going to have to fight with me because that doesn't have shvius on it yet. It's coming from last year still. Okay. But upon him, you have to know, Rabbi Isai, the lettuce that he showed me today, according to the Badatz, it's from the HaRav. It's from the HaRav Tzfoni, the northern HaRav. They hold it chutzlarts. Do what you want with it. According to Rav Yashiv in the Chazon Ish, it was planted this year. It's not kosher. It's not kosher. If you put it into your pots, it would treif up the pots. Groise, machlekes. Kamuvan, you have to ask a paisek, about paisai. Azah, hafla dika kiddush Hashem, zetzach zusammen, and learning the Torah of Shmitta, and koila loimed Shmitta is kilas malav because of kilu kimoy. That's a limit lane. And this will be a great schus for us. That will be zeichel this year that the Archikal will be in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, and I won't be the Magid by side. Moshe Feinstein will be the Magid, the Chazon Ish will be the Magid, and I'll be in the audience with my chaverim. Zusammen, we'll learn together. B'ez Hashem.